Anem a la següent ponència, que ens el farà en Dominic Couzens. That's right. Thank you. I la veritat és que ell té un historial com a escriptor, naturalista, ornitòleg impressionant, però el que més impressiona és el nom del seu llibre, que són els 20 ocells que tu has de veure al llarg de la teva vida. I llavors té com un subtítol, els ocells que tots els ornitòlegs voldríem o desitjaríem veure. Sense més preàmbul, us ho deixo amb ell, que segur que serà més interessant que el que us estic jo. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, yes, you can hear me. Well, I've no idea what you just said, so it could be absolutely anything, but I hope it's right. A very good evening to you. Have you had a good day? Yeah, you're out there, that's good. So I just want to say that it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here at the Delta Birding Festival, an absolute thrill. And for me, this talk is all about living a dream, and I'm doing mine now, because I'm in front of you in a foreign country talking about birds. And when I go home, I shall write about birds. And the next week, I shall write about birds again. And the week after, I might go somewhere else. So this, in a way, is a talk for aspiration. I hope that many of you here will hopefully be inspired to go and see more birds, maybe to write about birds as well. It's never too late to start. And if you're interested in birds, there is delight in every corner of the world, not just some of the birds I show you from different parts of the world, but right here. There's wonderful birds to see. And of course, you can see the flamingos and other things. And the other thing I wanted to say is thank you so much for being here. I know there's lots of attractions throughout the festival. Every person who does a talk like me has a dream the night before thinking no one's going to turn up. So I'm very pleased to see you all. So this talk is based on a book called 100 Birds to See Before You Die. Nevertheless, the Americans can't cope with death. So in America, it was 100 birds to see in your lifetime. So there is an interesting cultural difference. Now, if I was to show you 100 birds in the next half an hour, then it would be 30 seconds per species. So clearly, I'm not going to show you 100. I will show you 20 birds that I recommend that you see if you possibly can. But you could replace them with 20 others. When we originally wrote the book, I wrote it with a friend of mine called David Chandler. We came up with about 10 different things which would make a bird eligible to be in your bucket list, if you like. And some of those were beauty, rarity, how far away it was, and also how interesting it was. And so there are many different things that make a bird worth seeing. Now, there were 100 birds in the book, as I mentioned, 20 today. Now, what is a bird? What is the most unlikely bird that you should aspire to see? Here it is. But why on earth, therefore, do I have a picture of a feral pigeon on a talk like this? Well, it's because every single bird in the world has a story to tell. And some of those stories are truly extraordinary. I bet you didn't know that a feral pigeon is a superhero. It has got abilities and attributes that we can only dream of. It can be taken in a lorry. If it's a racing pigeon, it can be taken from a lorry from here in Catalonia to Norway, or even Sweden, if it's a very unfortunate bird. There's a Swede here, sorry, it's a friend of mine. And when it's released from the lorry, it flies back again. And still we don't know how it does it. And it can do that for thousands and thousands of kilometers. Now, you and I can't do that. Another thing that a pigeon can do is it can find its way using magnetic fields. And it can probably see magnetic fields with its eyes. And so when it's wandering around, in your garden, it can see magnetism. One of the most useful things is you may know that magnetism, the lines of incidence of the Earth go from south to north. The furthest you go north, the steeper the angle of incidence. And so a pigeon can tell exactly how far north or south it is, or indeed if it's on the equator. So those are two superhero facts. It can also probably tell what the weather is going to be like. It's very sensitive to barometric pressure. You only have to take a pigeon from down there, take it up 20 meters, and it can tell the difference in barometric pressure. Many years ago, in the UK, we had a very famous weather forecast that went wrong. A man said the weather was going to be fine, and we had our first hurricane for 200 years. And there was discussion about whether we should replace this man with a pigeon, because at least the pigeon would be. That's actually not true, that story I've told. One more superhero fact about pigeons is that they can hear infrasounds. We have an audible level of things that we can hear, high pitches and low pitches, but pigeons can hear much lower sounds than us. Those sounds have a very long wavelength, and so pigeons can probably hear things a very long way away, thousands of kilometers. It's perfectly possible that a pigeon here in Catalonia can hear a thunderstorm in Germany, literally using its infrasound capability. So don't just forget about pigeons. They're amazing. And here's another bird that you'd never think would be in anyone's wish list, the carrion crow. But the carrion crow is one of the most intelligent animals anywhere. We as humans are the most intelligent. The higher apes are very intelligent. Dolphins as well. But just behind them, birds. Birds are incredibly intelligent. They're very good at learning. My favorite carrion crow story concerns some that lived in Kyoto, which is a Japanese town. And every autumn, there was a big junction in Kyoto where there were some walnut trees, and the walnut trees fruited in the autumn. There was a big traffic junction there, and every year the carrion crows would, birds can see in color, so the crows would watch the traffic lights. So when the traffic lights were green, they went and plucked a walnut. When they waited for the traffic lights to be red, and they put the walnut down in front of the traffic. Then they flew off. They waited till it went green. The cars ran over the walnuts. The crows waited till they went red again, and then they came and ate the walnuts. Now that is pretty intelligent. So the fact is that birds with extraordinary characteristics are everywhere about us. So birds that we might see here at the Delta Festival, this is possibly a bit rare. This is the Arctic tern. And of course, everyone needs to see an Arctic tern because it has the longest migration of any bird in the world. So there are birds that literally breed up in the Arctic Circle, and after they breed there, they migrate south very quickly usually, and then they often go to the Antarctic, and they'll often circumnavigate the Antarctic as well, just for good measure. And so they will fly as much as 90,000 kilometers in their migratory journey, which is a pretty impressive thing. They also probably see more daylight than any other animal in the world, because they go from the summer Arctic to the summer Antarctic. Well, I say they see more daylight than any other animal in the world. There is actually another one that sees exactly the same amount of daylight as the Arctic tern, and that's the Arctic tern's feather lice, because those insects live on the feathers of Arctic terns, and they attach themselves to the tern, and they must have the best ride of any lice in the world. The Arctic tern, therefore, is a world record holder that you can see here, I think, in Catalonia. Probably not very common, but certainly in Europe, and not far to go to see it. A truly incredible bird. And here's another incredible bird that also, certainly in the Pyrenees, you get this bird called the crossbill. Now, there's many strange things about the crossbill. There are about 4 species. Some people say there are 4, some 3, some say there's 20. But basically, they're the birds in the world who have crossed mandibles. In every case in the crossbill, the lower jaw, the lower mandible, grows and it then twists either side of the upper mandible. So, does it twist to the left, as in that bird, or does it twist to the right? And it so happens that about 50% of crossbills are left-billed and 50% of crossbills are right-billed. And the right-billed crossbills are right-footed, and the left-billed crossbills are just like Lionel Messi. Yeah, I thought I might get a bit more of a reaction close to Barcelona, but anyway. And so they are left-footed, just like the master footballer. So this is an attribute we see in in the human race, although, of course, as you know, it's slightly different. As far as I know, a left-footed crossbill can mate with a left-footed crossbill, and so on and so forth. There is no particular difference between them. Isn't that a great fact? There's probably a lot more birds in the world that show this thing called footedness. It's officially called footedness. An amazing bird close to home. And this is a bird we saw yesterday, some of us here in the Delta. This is, of course, a bird that's going to be on every single person's wish list because, again, it's an incredible record holder. This is the peregrine falcon. The name peregrine, by the way, comes from the word peregrination, in English anyway, which means wanderer. The peregrine is the great wanderer. Anyway, as I'm sure you're all aware, it's the world's fastest animal. And every day there seems to be a different estimate of how fast it can fly. But it's probably about 180 to 200 kilometers an hour under its own steam. And when it is flying in a straight line, it can break 100 miles an hour, which is about 160 kilometers an hour. So this is an incredibly fast bird. But it's not the only amazing thing about the peregrine. It's also one of the world's most widely distributed birds. It's found on every continent except Antarctica. It entirely or almost entirely feeds on birds. So every bird that occurs in every part of the world where peregrines hunt will be potentially under threat, maybe not an ostrich, but most other birds. And so the peregrine has probably also eaten more species of birds than any other animal on Earth. So again, it's an amazing record breaker. But of course, you want me to talk about some of those less common birds, more exciting, more far-flung birds you might aspire to see. Well, I'm going to run through a few of those now. Actually, you do get this here, don't you, in the winter particularly. Every bird watcher always wants to see the wonderful wall creeper. And it's a really extraordinary bird which lives at extremely high altitude, not just in Europe, but right through to Asia. It's been recorded as high as some of all the other birds in the world. There's only alpine choughs, and a few others have been recorded higher than the wall creeper. But remarkably, in the winter, it will come down, and you can find it, as you, I'm sure, all aware, in towns on the foothills of the Pyrenees and various places like that. But the wall creeper, you know, is an aspirational bird because bird tour companies run trips just to see wall creepers. There's literally several bird tour companies in the UK. This is a wall creeper trip. So that's the one you go on. Now, we all have short lives, and there are certain birds that I feel that you must try to see in the wild if you possibly can. Of course, not everyone has the opportunity, but one of those is undoubtedly penguins. There are quite a few species of penguins in the world, about 18, and there's a few quite unusual facts about them. And one is that they're really not quite as far away as you might think. You can find them in South Africa. You can also find them in Australia if you go there. So these are not particularly, they're not places with lots of icebergs and things like that, so they are quite doable. One of my favorite facts about penguins is actually that they live in an extraordinarily wide range of temperatures. Andy may well have mentioned the Galapagos penguin, which is the only penguin that's ever been recorded in the northern hemisphere. It's been recorded, I think, in Costa Rica, and probably occurs just north of the equator in the Galapagos. When the Galapagos penguin is incubating its eggs, it's in temperatures of plus 40 degrees. And exactly the same time in the Antarctic, the emperor penguin could be doing exactly the same thing, incubating its eggs at minus 60 degrees. So you can have penguins on the Earth at the very same time, 100 degrees different in their environment, which is a pretty extraordinary fact. But do try and see penguins if you can. They're just so strange. And I once went to the Falkland Islands, and in the Falklands there's a wonderful lodge called Sea Lion Lodge on Sea Lion Island, and the whole lodge is surrounded by a penguin colony. But right inside the lodge's grounds, there's a pitch and putt golf course, and it's the only, you know what I mean, pitch and putt, do you use that term? A small golf course. And the unique thing about this pitch and putt is it's the only one in the world where if you hit a shot wrong, you might actually hit a penguin on the head, which is not I don't know how the rules of golf would view that as a hazard, but anyway. Again, in similar locations, everybody's got to see, if you can, to see an albatross. It's an aspirational bird, one of the greatest birds to see. They live among the longest lived birds in the world, 60 years plus. They can also be paired up for as long as 60 years, which is good even in human company. They also hold the record for the longest age of first breeding. The light-mantled sooty albatross doesn't normally breed until it's 13. So if you're ever short of useless facts, that's quite a good one. And also, an albatross can fly 1,000 kilometers a day. 1,000 kilometers a day. And a wandering albatross has been known to fly 240,000 kilometers in a year. It makes the Arctic tern look like an amateur. And they may be able to fly 1,000 kilometers without flapping their wings. Every person must see a hummingbird if you possibly can. Hummingbirds, my colleague Andy, you've just heard, has written the ultimate wonderful book on hummingbirds, which is available. I didn't even write this, so it's available 2 doors down and is a beautiful, one of the most beautiful books I've read. It's all about hummingbirds. There's about 300 species. They're all found in the Americas, and that's one of the things everyone knows about hummingbirds, is they're only found in the Americas, but they've also been recorded in Russia. So there are 1 or 2, 3 or 4 old world records. And there are fossil hummingbirds from France. So hummingbirds used to be much more widely distributed. This one is a crowned wood nymph, and they all have really daft names, these hummingbirds. I was once bird watching in Peru, and somebody called a bird that was flying across the path, and the bird was called an amethyst-throated sun angel. And the thing was, it flew quite fast. So he said, oh, it's an amethyst. And by the time that he got the name out, the bird had gone, which was unfortunate. These, of course, have these glittering iridescent plumage. Another great thing about hummers is that they're often found in very small parts of the world, a very narrow distribution. There's also common ones. You might know they also migrate across the Gulf of Mexico. They're incredible things. They flap their wings about 100 times, 80 times a second. They drink nectar all the time, and they are just incredible. So you've got to try, if you can, to see a hummingbird. Interestingly, there are actually 3 groups of birds in the world that specialize on feeding on nectar. Hummingbirds are one, and there's 2 others. Sunbirds, which is this one, this is a crimson sunbird, and honey eaters. These are the main 3 nectar eaters. And the really intriguing thing about these nectarivorous birds is the hummingbirds are the only ones that hover. Sunbirds don't hover much. There's a few exceptions. And honey eaters don't hover. In fact, they go on a perch and then drink, whereas the hummingbirds, as you know, hover in front of blooms, and the blooms often go into extraordinary lengths. There's co-evolution with all these flowers. It doesn't happen with sunbirds, just with hummingbirds. It doesn't happen with honey eaters. Nevertheless, the crimson sunbird and others, beautiful ones. And one of the things nectar eaters often do, you know, the plant often goes to an enormous amount of trouble to evolve a huge flower head. Well, the hummingbirds often cheat. They say, I can't be bothered to hover in front of this. So they just use their bills to pierce the bottom of the flower and drink the nectar without making the effort. Everything in nature tries to be lazy, it seems. Now, here's a bird that just everybody seems to want to see. It's called the resplendent quetzal. It's found in Central America. Again, people often go on special expeditions to see quetzals. And the people in Guatemala love quetzals so much that their currency is called the quetzal. And as you can see, it's pretty beautiful. It also happens to eat a lot of avocados. And it's one of the best places to find it, is a fruiting avocado tree. It seems that all this effort the male goes to have this beautiful, long, glittering tail. Isn't it funny how, you know, when we're dating, we try and look as good as we could, and then times move on and we have children and everything gets a bit messy, and the quetzal nests in a hole, and it has to bring food to its young, and it brings the food to the nest hole, and eventually its plumage gets worn, and the same thing happens. You might, before you have children, you look smart, and once you have the kids for a while, your wardrobe goes downhill. And that's what happens a bit with the quetzal. This is an African representative, a bird that everyone wants to see, the shoebill. I was very fortunate to see shoebill a couple of years ago in Uganda. It's only found in the papyrus swamps of tropical Africa. And the huge bill, which is shaped like a clog, a Dutch clog, is used for catching very large fish. And when a shoebill finds a fish, it doesn't matter what it looks like. It leans forward with its bill, and if necessary, it'll jump forward and completely fall over, make an absolute sight of itself. But it doesn't care, because it will catch the lungfish or whatever species it's after. Now, there are not many birds in the world which can kill you. But if you do aspire to seeing a lot of birds throughout the world, you have to be a little careful with a few of them. And the most dangerous bird in the world, in terms of the number of people it's actually killed, apart from badly cooked chicken, of course, is the cassowary. This is a cassowary found in northern Australia and also New Guinea, various places around there, Australasia. And it has enormous feet, and the 3 claws, and the central claw, central foot toe, has a very long claw, which can be used to very seriously disable anyone who attacks it. And there is an account of a young man, a teenager in Sydney, near Cairns in Australia, who became the first settler to be killed by a cassowary. When he disturbed it, it probably had young, and it clawed him with its central claw, and he bled to death. And there's been several occasions where zookeepers have also been killed by cassowaries. They also occur in New Guinea, and possibly quite a lot of people who live in the forest there have also been killed by these birds. So I can assure you from personal experience that when you see this bird, there is a real frisson of danger, which is unusual among birds. I mean, let's face it, a blue tit is not going to kill you, but a cassowary might. Now, some birds really mainly appeal to birders, and gulls, let's face it, are among those. Several of us who've been invited to the festival to speak, we went gull watching this morning, and most people who would have accompanied us would have been bored stiff, I'm quite sure. We thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. Gulls are definitely birders' birds, but there is perhaps one exception, the Ross's gull. It doesn't quite show it on here, but it's very pink underneath. When the Ross's gull was first discovered about 150 years ago, the skin of the Ross's gull, you know, they used to shoot them and keep the skins for collections. This is the 19th century. And there's a story of a Russian expedition that went to try and get Ross's gulls. And they went up to the Arctic, where this bird occurs, the Russian and also the North American Arctic. And there's about 20 of them, I think. And their ship was destroyed by the pack ice. And they were 100 miles away from the mainland of Russia. And what they did was they still had some small boats. They walked over the ice floes they could. They rowed. It took them 3 weeks or so. They had very little food. They caught a few things, seals and stuff along the way. But it was a story of basic survival. It was touch and go as to whether they'd ever see their loved ones again. And when they reached the mainland of Russia, one of the men who was on the expedition showed everybody else that during the whole escape procedure, this is a good dramatic music for this, during the escape procedure, this guy had kept 3 Ross's gull skins under his coat for the whole of the time. That's how valuable Ross's gull skins were. They probably paid for the expedition. There are many birds that are worth seeing simply for having very strange and extraordinary behavior. This is a superb fairy wren, the sort of bird that really annoys dogs, clearly. This is found in Australia, so if you go to Sydney, you'll find it in your garden. And it's extraordinarily beautiful, as you can see. I sometimes wonder, you know, the Australians are known as sort of they like to see themselves as rugged survivalists. I do wonder sometimes if they can quite cope with having some of their birds called fairy wrens, but anyway. Culturally, apologies, you might have missed that somewhat, but anyway. The fairy wren is in a group of birds called the Australian wrens, and they live in groups. There's a senior male and a senior female, and they are responsible for the breeding attempt. And living with them are young birds, usually which have been, in other words, they're children. They live with them sometimes for as long as 6 years. So they all live in this family group. What's extraordinary about the fairy wrens, though, is that the males are extraordinarily unfaithful to their partners. So both of them actually, both the males and females, extraordinarily. Only about 40% of young fairy wrens come from the actual male and female that bring them up. The really amazing story about the fairy wren is what happens just prior to breeding. Any male that fancies the neighboring female spends the pre-breeding period making dawn visits to the female of his choice next door or down the lane, and he will bring her flowers. So he picks a flower in his bill, goes to the girl next door, offers her a flower, and not surprisingly, she's somewhat bowled over, and an extra pair youngster will be born. An amazing little bird. Another bird we often overlook, actually, very easy to see in India. I've just been in Sri Lanka as well, where peacocks are absolutely everywhere, very common birds, are very easily overlooked and underrated. And of course, the number of eyes on the peacock shows who's the top dog in the community. So the more eyes, the better the male. So the females walk around, all they have to do is count the eyes, and they very quickly find the best male. Now, wouldn't life be so much simpler if it worked for us? Just go, count the number of whatever, and you know who the best male is. Much easier. Some birds have extraordinary lifestyles adapted to particular environments. So again, you wouldn't necessarily want to go a long way to see a white-plumed antbird per se. It's quite pretty. You know, you're in a nice place when you're looking at it. But the great thing about the white-plumed antbird is it has an amazing lifestyle. Every single day of the year, the white-plumed antbird wakes up and it thinks, I'm going to look for food. And it has a particular way of finding food. First, it finds an ant swarm. It doesn't eat the ants because the ants get very cross about it, but it feeds on the insects that are fleeing the ants. And that's what it does all day, every day. That's its job. Wakes up, finds an ant swarm, gets the ants, and eats them, and that's its day. Obviously, it breeds, which might make things slightly more interesting, but that's basically what it does. I was very fortunate to be in Costa Rica fairly recently, and we woke up in the morning, we were before first light, to try and see a different species of antbird. And what I hadn't realized is that they spend the first frantic minutes of the morning, they wake up, they've got to find an ant swarm, because they're hungry. And it's not always that easy, because the ant bivouacs move around. So the first half hour of an antbird's day, they have to rush around and try and find the ants. And the sense of tension is palpable. Another intriguing bird, I mean, you wouldn't go a long way for that, but there are hundreds of birds I could have showed you, but a friend of mine showed me this picture of a yellow-rumped honeyguide the other day. And I thought, it's an interesting bird to show the people at Delta Festival. This is the sort of bird has very strange behavior. It's a group of birds called brood parasites. So it lays its eggs in the nests of whole nesting birds. So it does that unusual piece of behavior. And it also, the males have territories surrounding the beeswax produced by just one species of bee. And so, again, the male spends all day performing a display in front of a bee's nest because it eats beeswax. They're the only birds in the world that can eat beeswax. The females come along and they judge the male by the quality of his territory and how much beeswax he's got in his territory. It's not easy being a male bird, actually. If you haven't got eyes, you've got to have beeswax or whatever. The female bird is hard to please. It seems to be a fairly worldwide phenomenon. Of course, some birds have fantastic cultural importance. Here at the festival, my good friend Niall and I were happening to talk about very tits because we've both been to Japan and how gorgeous they are. I mean, is that a pretty bird or not? It's fantastic. And he told me, I didn't know this actually before, day before yesterday, but the Japanese keep the very tit and use it as a fortune teller on the Japanese streets. So you go there and the very tit will take a card for you, which is obviously at random, and that will tell your fortune for you, apparently. So that's a bird of cultural importance. Now, this is my last picture, and this bird is an indigo bunting, and I've only got the indigo bunting because it's fairly pretty. It's not that pretty, it's quite pretty. It occurs in North America, a reasonable song. But, excuse me, the reason I have the indigo bunting is it has a wonderful story associated with a little bit of scientific discovery. So again, that makes it a very worthwhile bird to go and see in your lifetime. And the indigo bunting was used as a test subject in the study of bird migration in the US. So what they did, they took some indigo buntings and they reared them in captivity The indigo bunting is a migrant bird, and the young indigo buntings were divided into two groups. There was a control group, and those birds at night were kept under a planetarium with the stars arranged as normal, with the pole star in the north. And they were reared as you would expect. Then the non-control group, the experimental group of indigo buntings, they were reared, and each night they were exposed to a planetarium in which Betelgeuse, which is as far south as you can go, replaced the North Star. So they were raised in a reverse planetarium with the stars in the polar opposite position. And guess what happened the autumn afterwards when the young chicks were ready to migrate? The control group flew south, as you would expect, but the ones that had been raised in the inverted planetarium flew north. And there are two things that proved, which is absolutely fantastic. Firstly, it proved that birds do watch the stars, but the other thing that's amazing, the rotation of the stars, that is, the other thing that's really wonderful, I'll leave you, I think, with this thought, that indigo buntings, they are brought up in cup nests. As soon as they hatch, every night, indigo buntings look up for their nest and watch the rotation of the stars. Isn't that a wonderful, wonderful thought? The thing is, everybody, that the world is full of birds with stories. The world is full of birds that are incredible. There is a lifetime out there of seeing birds and appreciating the extraordinary things that they do. So you may not be able to go in your lifetime to every corner of the world, but you'll certainly be able to see 100 birds with incredible stories and inspirational things to tell us in your lifetime. And I hope this inspires you to take a slightly closer look at some of the birds that you'll have the privilege of seeing. So thank you so much for listening, and good evening.